Conference 2010. Our first speaker is Sean Roberts.
Hi, thanks. I'm going to be talking about bilingualism and language evolution. I'm going to be talking very briefly about social networks. I leave most of that to Justin Quillan, who's going to be talking after me. But our talks are related in some ways. What I'm going to focus on is how bilingualism is marginalized in theories of language evolution and why it shouldn't be. So language evolution, a part of it is the study of how languages evolve under a selective pressure to become more learnable. What I mean by that, if a language is easier to learn, more people will learn it, so more people will speak it, more people will pass it on to the next generation, and that language will become more prevalent in the population. So there's an analogy with biological evolution here. Organisms which are better at reproducing become more prevalent in the population. But for language, the way children learn affects the selective pressure for languages. This affects the kinds of languages that evolve. Despite this, the ability to learn two languages at once is largely ignored in language evolution. And this might be an important oversight if monolinguals and bilinguals learn in different ways. That's what I'm going to be talking about. But very briefly, here's my working hypothesis. There's an amount of linguistic variation in a learner's input. But what I'm going to be arguing is the level of linguistic variance affects the optimal learning strategy. So if there's a lot of linguistic variance, your approach to the data might be different. And I'm going to be talking about this through some studies of mutual exclusivity. I've already said the way children learn affects the selective pressures on language, and then this feeds back into the kinds of languages that evolve. So there's a co-evolution between this linguistic variance, learning, and selective pressures on language. I'm also going to talk very briefly about how network dynamics can affect linguistic variance. And I've been studying this with the help of Twitter. Less serious than you might think. And also Justin Quillan is going to talk about what happens when linguistic variance can affect the network dynamics. But for now, let's look a bit more closely at language evolution. So languages evolve under a selective pressure to become more learnable. If you imagine a toy language where you have determined nouns and prepositions, and there are four possible grammars, four possible ways that they could be structured. I'm going to make a model where a teacher speaks one of these to a learner, and with a certain amount of noise, so sometimes there's a bit of variance in there, and the learner tries to guess which one of these speakers if the teacher is speaking, and then speaks that himself to the next generation. So this is iterative language evolution. However, the two at the top, the two grammars at the top are consistently headed. So they either branch always to the right or always to the left. The two on the bottom are inconsistently headed. Now, say if a child finds consistently headed languages easier to learn, say 10% easier to learn than inconsistently headed languages, then we'd expect more consistently headed languages in the population of languages. In fact, this is what we find. So this is a model of what I've been talking about. And in the first generation, there are 50, so this is the prevalence of consistently headed languages in the population. It begins at 50% for each, so an even amount. But over time, it stabilizes. There are slightly more consistent languages than inconsistent languages. And the bias in the individual learner is reflected in the proportion of consistently headed languages. Note for real evolutionary linguists, these are sampling learners, and things change very differently depending on other assumptions. Still, this is a basic finding in language evolution. And what I'm going to do now is allow the learners to be bilingual, to assume that the teacher might be speaking more than one language. And this is what happens. So I'll take you through this very slowly. The blue line is, again, the prevalence of consistently headed languages. And that's lower now. It's just slightly above 50%, so there is a bias towards them. But the number of people speaking only consistent languages is now dropped. And the number of people speaking at least one consistent language is much higher. And the level of bilingualism, the red buff here, increases. So people become bilingual over time. Now, this is something I've done this week, so I'm not sure if I'm not sure what to draw from it. I'm not even sure if it's right, what I want you to take away from this is that if we allow bilingualism to be part of the theory of language evolution, not only do the dynamics of language evolution change, but our approach to the analysis has to change as well. So I've said bilingualism is underrepresented in the field of language evolution. This is not an understatement. Here's a quote from my supervisor, Professor of Language Evolution, Simon Kirby. Surely people don't use two different languages in the same sentence. This is what I'm up against. The canonical learner in a language evolution model is an agent which tries to settle on a single grammar that explains all the variance in its input. And it often assumes this variance is coming from a single teacher. In language evolution, bilingualism is seen as a social linguistic phenomenon where two monolingual societies which have evolved language already interact. Especially within the modeling community, monolingualism is seen as a necessary abstraction to get at the more fundamental dynamics of language evolution. So implicitly, bilingualism is seen as not a fundamental aspect of language and a secondary linguistic ability. However, as we all know, bilingualism is prevalent and the norm in most societies. In fact, getting statistics for the amount of bilingualism is very difficult, especially in less industrialized societies, but here are some. In the USA, about 20% bilingual. In Canada, slightly more. In the EU, about half people and 1 in 20 speaking 4 languages. In less industrialized societies, the amount of bilingualism might be even more, so an average of 5 or 6 languages spoken in Papua New Guinea and some parts of Brazil. On top of this, there doesn't appear to be large differences in the linguistic milestones for monolinguals and bilinguals. Bilinguals certainly don't take twice as long to learn 2 languages as monolinguals take to learn 1. Another aspect that's been studied is adult acquisition. Adults learn language very differently to children. And recently, Lippian and Dale have argued that this affects the selective pressure on language. And they've shown that languages which have a large non-native population, lots of non-native speakers, tend to be morphologically simpler to accommodate the adult learners. And so we might want to take that into account. Also, as we've heard in some of the talks in this conference, finding monolinguals who really are monolinguals, but have had no influence from other languages, is sometimes actually very difficult. It also gets more complicated if we see language change as sort of branching from, say, Indo-European into other languages. This picture is complex enough. But if we allow languages to inherit words from more than one language at the same time, then we get something that's far more complicated. This is an automatic graph made from the online etymology dictionary, where I've got traced words back. So we have words coming into modern English from all different kinds of languages, but also going to and from other different kinds of languages in many ways. I'm not going to talk about that. All I'm going to say is the picture is complicated by including bilingualism. In that case, a monolingual approach to language evolution doesn't seem appropriate, and especially if bilinguals and monolinguals have different learning strategies. And that's what I'm going to talk about very quickly. So imagine yourself in this situation. Here's a guy saying, "Excuse me, could you please pass me the spiver?" This is you. You've never heard the word spiver before, but there are some objects that he might be referring to. I'm hoping everyone in the audience is assuming that this weird thing that you've never seen before is the spiver. So in this context, we've actually learned that this is called spiver. However, I'm going to change this situation very slightly. This man is now clearly from Australia. He's saying, "What do you mean a spiver?" I don't know about you, but suddenly I'm less sure about what he's referring to. Presumably this is partly because he's an outsider. I'm not used to talking to Australian people, with the exception of Justin Quillenham. But he's also using linguistic variants that I'm not used to. And if he's using other words for things I don't know, maybe he calls a screwdriver something else. Anyway, why am I talking about this? Well, these are examples of cross-situational learning. In the first example, we're all using mutual exclusivity, the idea that the word we haven't heard matched with the object we haven't seen. And monolingual children exhibit this from a very young age. Here's some citations. And recently, it's been shown that bilinguals don't reliably show mutually exclusive behavior. So presumably this is something to do with the amount of variation in their input. So like in the second situation I showed you, they can't make the same assumptions that monolinguals can. And what I'd like to see is mutual exclusivity as a kind of corner-cutting tactic available for monolinguals because the amount of linguistic variation is lower. But the default approach is the bilingual situation. So let's fit that in. Again, like I said, if the amount of linguistic variation can affect the way you learn, then this affects the selective pressure on language and the way languages evolve.